Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Rishi Sunak calls a general election for the 4th of July. Welcome to the fastest show in politics with breaking news on both sides of the Atlantic today in the world of politics. I'm Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. And Kailey, it seems the Prime Minister thought earlier was better.
Yeah, we thought that the UK might have an election in the fall. Not so. It will happen in July, just about 6 weeks from now, an announcement that caught many by surprise today on both sides of the pond. And certainly that is the case for our wonderful Bloomberg team who is standing by, including Lizzy Barton, who is outside 10 Downing Street right now as we speak. After just in the last hour, we heard from Rishi Sunak himself calling for this election on the 4th of July. Lizzy, why now?
Well, Kailey, you know we Brits like to talk about the weather, but you'll have to excuse me. I'm going to have to do it. Rishi Sunak came out in one of his expensive suits and it got soaked. I'm sure he could afford another. Why has he chosen July? Well, it's no coincidence that UK inflation was announced as having fallen to 2.3% in April today, this morning. And Rishi Sunak says that's back to normal, near enough for him to the Bank of England's 2% target. So he wants to present to the nation that the economy has turned a corner under his watch. But it's not just monetary reasons, it's also fiscal. Recent public finance data and warnings from the IMF suggest that any hope of tax cuts in an autumn budget wouldn't really be possible because they might not have the wriggle room. And just finally, political reasons. They want to make immigration front and centre of this campaign. They might have been able to send a flight to Rwanda with asylum seekers on board by that date. So this election on July the 4th could be a very, very different one from the one in 2019, the last one here in the UK. This won't be about Brexit. It'll be about health, immigration and the economy.
Pretty incredible when you consider the timeline here, Lizzy. We're in the process of covering the longest presidential election, the general election, in modern American history. How do you compress a campaign into 5 to 6 weeks and deliver a message? What will this look like for him?
Well, the whole time Rishi Sunak's been in number 10 Downing Street, he's been campaigning on the economy. His top priority was to halve inflation by the end of last year. It happened, and now inflation is at 2.3%. But really, can he take credit for that when it's the Bank of England's job to reduce inflation, really, as we know? But look, Rishi Sunak has also been campaigning on immigration and the NHS. But at the moment, things aren't looking so good on those two factors. In the healthcare, for example, look at NHS waiting lists, part of the reason for the economic inactivity problem here in the UK, which factors back into inflation. But the poll gap between the ruling Conservatives and the Labour Party just has not been shrinking. So he's not naturally a risk taker, but he's decided to roll the dice and call an election earlier than everybody in Westminster really had expected. Most had thought it would be autumn.
Well, Lizzy, as you mentioned the Labour Party and how, in fact, they are leading substantially in the polls. It's been 14 years since they were in power. The Conservatives have been in power since 2010. Just how great of a change could this bring to the UK, assuming that the polls are right and Keir Starmer replaces Rishi Sunak?
Well, Keir Starmer made his own speech following Rishi Sunak's, and he's keen to emphasise not just the change that he could deliver from Rishi Sunak, but also from his predecessor as the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. He presents that he's made a huge turnaround within the party on anti-Semitism, but he also presents that he could provide stability, unlike the instability that we've seen in the Conservative Party. We've had Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and now Rishi Sunak since the 2019 election. And I have to say, I've been to both the party conferences from Labour and the Conservatives over recent years. And over that time, business has seen the value in the Labour Party, and they have been flocking to pitch what they want to who the polls suggest are going to be the next government.
Bloomberg's Lizzy Burden outside number 10 Downing. Lizzy, thank you so much for joining us with breaking news today. This just emerged in the last couple of hours, Kailey, and pretty remarkable. They're going to be off and running already on a 5 to 6 week sprint that we'll, of course, be covering right here on Balance of Power, with our other top story today being the new Bloomberg News Morning Consult swing state poll. Numbers hit this morning, bringing potentially good and bad news to Joe Biden. The fact of the matter is Joe Biden, Kailey, still trails Donald Trump by 4 percentage points when you look at our numbers from across the 7 states that we've identified. But when it comes to the blue wall, there might be some glimmers of hope, and we don't want to mischaracterize this. If the election were held today, according to our poll, Donald Trump would win.
Yeah, of course, Joe Biden will very likely need the blue wall if he would like to win. Those are the states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. In all of those, Biden and Trump are separated by no more than 2 percentage points. So it is incredibly close. And that's just another thing that speaks to how turnout ultimately is going to be so consequential in this election. We're
going to get to the horse race now with Eli Yoakley, with our partners at Morning Consult, but also some fascinating revelations here to learn that equal shares of Democrats and Republicans both fear violence around the election, both fear the impact of artificial intelligence. And it's interesting when you consider some of the things we have in common on both sides of the aisle. Eli, thank you for joining us on this poll day. Let's start with the horse race. Should Joe Biden be smiling looking at these numbers, knowing that Donald Trump has been stuck in a courtroom for the balance of this poll?
I'm not sure that either candidate should be smiling at this point. These are very close contests across the swing state map. Now, the one thing that might make the president smile a bit is the fact that since the winter, he has seen his support improve a bit as voters have come off the sidelines. But look, I mean, he's still underwater in most of these states. He's tied in Nevada. He's up by just a hair in Michigan. But if the election were held today, Joe Biden would be in a really tough spot.
Yeah, he would. Of course, to your point, though, Eli, where we are seeing some improvement in certain states, including some improvement in the Sun Belt for Joe Biden, how much can we draw a line to that improvement on Biden's part, or perhaps it is Trump that is falling back rather than Biden moving forward? How much can we attribute to the trial that Joe just mentioned, the idea that he has been stuck in a courtroom? Does the poll give any indication?
I'm not sure the trial has really moved a lot of minds on this contest yet. I think the bigger deal in this race was Super Tuesday and State of the Union week. I mean, in all of our national tracking, that's when the race started tightening a bit as independent voters in particular started to understand what the choice would actually be in this election. Donald Trump continues to do very, very well with his Republican base and folks who voted for him back in 2020. Joe Biden is continuing to struggle a bit with his voters, and small margins here matter a lot. We mentioned Nevada. I mean, that's a state where the Joe Biden path to victory is pretty clear. I mean, it's the state where he is doing best right now with his own Democratic base. That's what the president really needs to rev up as we head toward November. There's a lot of issues at play here. I'm not sure how big of a deal Donald Trump's trial is currently until we get a verdict.
Pretty remarkable, Eli, to see half of swing state voters, equal shares of Democrats and Republicans, say they fear violence breaking out around this election. It's hard to turn to an analysis piece or a newscast without hearing violence mentioned tied to the political conventions coming up, never mind the aftermath of the elections themselves. Are you surprised to see this shared equally on both sides?
Not necessarily. I mean, we've seen Republicans talk a lot about the kinds of protests we saw, be it the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, be it these college campus protests this year, really trying to rev up fears about Democratic agitators. And of course, Democrats have something they can point to back in 2021 when Trump supporters stormed the Capitol. I think recent history in the minds of both sides of the aisle for different reasons help fuel this. That same question asks about election fairness, too, by the way. That's something where Democrats are very strong in trust in the system. Republicans are not. Those numbers, we're going to watch those move. Donald Trump's been talking a lot about whether or not he'll accept the 2024 election results, just like he didn't accept them back in 2020. That talk probably hasn't broken through as much yet. But as we get closer to Election Day, that continues. I bet these numbers could tick up a little bit.
Well, and as we look at these numbers, 6 in 10 swing state voters worried about misinformation. Does that actually potentially suggest, though, that voters are very aware of the content in which they're taking political content specifically in this election, and whether or not there could have been foreign interference or artificial intelligence, things like deepfakes, that's not just something that, say, we in the media or in the political realm are thinking about, that voters are actually quite wary of and privy to?
Yeah. I think that is almost a bigger concern among Republicans, that AI is going to be a problem in the election in terms of the swing state voters. It's one thing to know it exists. It's another thing to see it in your daily lives. And I think we've seen folks have a hard time deciphering all of this. At the same time, there's a whole media base online that pushes out fake videos all the time. The average American probably isn't sitting there and fact-checking themselves. And so that actually ranks lower on the concerns about AI, by the way. I mean, the biggest concern for voters is privacy. But I think as this campaign plays out, this is something that I think Democrats are going to lean into talking about quite a bit, just given the foreign actors that have moved against Democrats in the past. I think it'll be incumbent on President Biden to raise this concern on the voters.
All right, Eli Yoakley, always great to have you on Poll Day. He is U.S. Politics Analyst at Morning Consult, which, of course, is Bloomberg's partner in this poll of the 7 key swing states. But we want to dig more into the issue specifically around election security, given the concerns that swing state voters say, according to our polling, they have around this election cycle. And turn now to Tina Barton. She is vice chair of the Committee on Safe and Secure Elections, and she is joining us in our Washington, D.C. studio. Welcome to Bloomberg Television and Radio. Tina, thank you so much for coming in. Obviously, as we are in this election cycle, a lot of people are living with the ghost of 2020 and everything that has happened in the aftermath. Compared to what we saw 4 years ago, how safe and secure will elections be this year?
Well, I think one of the things that we're specifically focused on with the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections is the safety and security of election officials. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we have seen is even in just the last year, that election officials, more than 10% have increased as saying that they have been threatened in the past. So we've gone from 28% up to 38%. So we're seeing this increase of threats towards election officials. And so part of our focus is keeping them safe, but also keeping the process safe. So with the committee, we're out doing tabletop exercises all across the country, some of those being in some of these swing states where we're holding the tabletops and bringing all of these issues to the table and bringing election officials and law enforcement and saying, how would we work through this if this were to happen in your community or in your county or state?
I want to hear more about that. What kind of scenarios are you modeling, and do they include the monitoring of drop boxes, for instance? We saw a lot of concern in the midterms, the last election, masked people in some cases, sitting in trucks, in some cases visibly armed, filming people as they drop ballots.
So we certainly have a few different scenarios. One of those can be the Dropbox scenario. We work usually with the secretary or the chief election official of the state or the county to see, what are you concerned about happening in your state? So typically some of the things that we're working on now would be things like fentanyl, getting an unknown substance in the mail. We've seen that happen in approximately a half a dozen states in over the last 9 months. So we're looking at that. What would that look like for your continuation of operation? What would that look like for chain of command and chain of custody if that were to happen? We're also looking at things like swatting. What happens if the chief election official is swatted, and what should they expect to happen? And we're seeing that happen to election officials across the country also, some of those being in swing states. And we're seeing it on both sides of both parties that is happening to election officials. We're also looking at disturbances. What if something happens in an actual precinct? What if it happens outside? Maybe it is armed individuals who are bringing intimidation to the polling place. Working through those scenarios, hearing exactly what would we do, what type of plan would we put into place, and making sure we are prepared for it if it should happen.
So do larger amounts of resources now have to go into making sure polling places are secure? Is there greater coordination with either local or state authorities, just given the increase in threats that you have spoken to?
Yeah, recently the Brennan Center did a survey with election officials, and we saw that over 90% of them have had to increase their budget and make improvements that are security related, whether that's hardening their facilities or it's securing the process itself. So they're putting lots of effort, lots of money into that. But we're also seeing 83% of them are saying we have to have some budget increases over the next 5 years or our elections are going to be in trouble. Wow. We need better funding.
Is this geographically neutral? Are there states that are more problematic than others when you look at this on a national level, or is this something everyone's dealing with?
Certainly in those swing states, there's a lot of passion.
Is that right?
There are a lot, Michigan obviously has seen its share. I'm from Michigan. We've had, our chief election official, Secretary Benson, who has had individuals at her home. Our governor, I was threatened after the 2020 election cycle. We've seen it in Georgia, Arizona, places like that where we are seeing that. But we're seeing this across the country. Yeah. This is a countrywide problem. When you're seeing that nearly 40% of election officials, and we have over 10,000 in our country, 40% is a really high number to say that they've been threatened, harassed, or abused.
You were
over
threatened
the last
because
year.
of your work with this organization?
Work as a former election official.
I see. In what form were you threatened?
So I actually had a voicemail that came in after the November 2020 election where the individual said that when I least expected it, that he would kill me. And so that individual was actually arrested by the DOJ.
They were identified.
Yes. He pled guilty in February of this year and will be sentenced in July of this year for threatening to kill me and my family. I was the chief election official in Rochester Hills, Michigan.
I'm very sorry you had to go through that. So this is personal.
It's personal, absolutely.
And I'm sure that there are countless stories like yours that are out there in the
Again, with nearly
40%
out of over 10,000 election officials saying they've been threatened, harassed, or abused. I am one of that 38%, but I'm certainly one that is being incredibly vocal to bring attention to the fact that this is happening in our country. Your statistics in your report that you put out that over 50% are concerned about violence for the election. We see that paralleled in the elections community where over 53% of election officials are concerned about their safety and the safety of their colleagues.
And obviously a lot of this is threats to physical safety, but I would imagine technology, things like phone calls or deep fakes or the ability to access other people only makes that threat even more pronounced.
Right. That's one of the scenarios that we work through is, in 2020, we had the pandemic and we were responding to all of those things and the political emotion that was rising then. And in 2024, each election cycle seems to bring something new. We have AI, and that's exactly what we're seeing. And that's one of the scenarios that we work through. If there were to be some sort of a call go out, say from the election administrator, mirroring their voice and sending that out to others, what would that look like for them?
Tina, thank you for being so flexible with your timing today. I'm glad we could have this conversation on Bloomberg. It's a very important one. Tina Barton is vice chair of the Committee on Safe and Secure Elections, with us here on Balance of Power on this day that we do learn both Democrats and Republicans share the same fears leading into this election cycle. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz. We'll assemble our panel next on the fastest show in politics on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
You mentioned the invite, Kailey. Benjamin Netanyahu, before a joint session of Congress, knowing that he is one of the most controversial figures in the world right now, and certainly has been making life difficult for Joe Biden. This is how Mike Johnson is going to answer the ICC arrest warrant, by inviting him here to the U.S. Remember, David Miller was talking to us last night about what would happen if they wanted to extradite Benjamin Netanyahu while he was outside of Israel.
Yeah, it definitely presents a whole host of questions, not least of which also is how does the Democratic Senate leader, Chuck Schumer, deal with this? Because theoretically he would need to be on board. But remember, it was Chuck Schumer who earlier this year gave a speech on the Senate floor essentially calling for new elections in Israel and the ouster of the very prime minister that we're talking about here, that he could then invite to speak to his chamber in this joint session. It's very politically and geopolitically complicated.
It's hard to tell what's real here with so much messaging happening in the House, but let's see what the panel thinks. Jeanne Zaino is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor, of course, Democratic analyst, and now senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, joined by Lester Munson, Republican strategist, principal at BGR Group. Jeanne, what's Joe Biden going to do if Benjamin Netanyahu is brought to Washington to address a joint session of Congress? He might not get a meeting at the White House on that trip, right?
Yeah, Joe Biden did call what the ICC did and the steps they have taken outrageous. So he has been very clear about his views. And of course, we are not a signatory to the ICC. So Netanyahu would be free to travel here. We'd be under no obligation to arrest Netanyahu. That said, it does put Joe Biden, it does put Chuck Schumer and the Democrats in a bit of a political quandary, because you do have many members supporting the president with his outrage. But you also have some like Pocan in Wisconsin who have said if Netanyahu visits, I am going to help the ICC issue this arrest warrant, which is, I believe, outrageous itself that he would do that. But it is what we're hearing. So it does divide the Democrats. And it is politically, for that reason, a fraught moment that Chuck Schumer says he is working his way through. I think in the end, he will go along with the speaker on this. But it is, a political challenge for Democrats at this point.
Well, and for one Democrat in particular, Lester, being President Biden, we have been talking a lot about our new poll out today, Bloomberg swing state poll with Morning Consult. And question is asked in that poll on Israel. Back in November, we asked about whether Joe Biden was doing the right amount to help Israel. More people said that in November than they do now. Increasing numbers say he's either doing too much or too little, which speaks to the idea that potentially for this Democratic administration, there is no real winning on this issue, Lester.
Well, it's a difficult foreign policy issue. There's no doubt. Israel and the Palestinians presents an issue that every single American president has struggled with. But it's also an opportunity for President Biden to show leadership. I think embracing the prime minister if he comes, having the meeting in the White House. You can have tough words when the door closes, but showing staunch support for a U.S. ally in a difficult situation is something the American people appreciate. I think even if they may have some concerns about the policy, they want to see an American president stand up and take tough positions because it's in the best interest of the United States. And I think in this case, if you're choosing between Israel and Hamas, there's only one choice the president can actually make. And so this is an opportunity for him if he wants to seize it.
We're wondering as well, as we spend time with our panel today, Jeanne and Lester, if there's going to be an answer in Congress to the controversy surrounding Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito flying an upside-down American flag, realizing he said his wife put it there, but out in front of his house in Alexandria, Virginia, following the election in 2020, representing the Stop the Steal movement. Even some Republicans are criticizing Alito for this, Jeanne, and there's been talk potentially of a legislative answer, although Dick Durbin in the Senate, of course, Senate Judiciary Committee, says Samuel Alito should simply recuse himself. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the way to do it would be to do what justices always do, which is they make a personal recusal decision. So I think that's very important. I know there are steps in the Senate and in the House and discussions about censure, and we may see something like that. But I will tell you, just from a political standpoint, I am not clear on why the Biden administration and President Biden, given where he is in the Bloomberg Consult poll and in this election overall, doesn't think that now is the time to take bold action as it pertains to the Supreme Court. We have Donald Trump talking about restricting contraception. We have the overturning of Roe v. Wade, all kinds of concerns about that. Why not go out there and say, you know what, I wasn't sure about packing the court, but now I'm going to, because if Donald Trump wins, he will have 2 more appointments to the court when Thomas and Alito retire. And that will be a 5-4 majority where Donald Trump will have chosen 5 Supreme Court justices. And those justices will sit on that court rather long after he is gone. And when your children are growing up and becoming adults. So now is the time for Joe Biden to take action and show that strength that Lester was just talking about. Not be cautious. Talk about some kind of Supreme Court reform, whether it's mandatory retirements or whether it is packing the court. You may not get it done like FDR, but at least you tried. And this is an issue that people are concerned about.
Lester, does talk of packing the court, though, risk backfiring? Does that potentially seem extreme to some undecided voters?
Yeah, Jeanne and I have been in total agreement until now. I think it would be a mistake for the president to do that. The Supreme Court the judiciary is a separate, independent branch of government. Just because you get a policy outcome that you don't approve of doesn't mean one branch of government should go to war with the other. I think the specter of packing the court is worse than any single decision the Supreme Court could come out with. The idea that you're going to politically manipulate the structure of the Supreme Court to guarantee certain outcomes goes against the entire purpose of having an independent judiciary. So I do think that would be a mistake. I think he can talk about his position on the issues, and he can talk about if the Democrats want to pursue this, family planning issues or the abortion issue, entirely fair game. Go make the case. They're going to have a pretty good reaction, I think, among voters. But I think changing the nature of the Supreme Court is going too far.
I think this is fascinating where this conversation has led us here. So what do you think, Jeanne? Could Joe Biden motivate enough progressives with that move to make up for the many conservatives he would anger?
I'm not convinced he would do any better than FDR in packing the court. I would assume it's not going to work the way it did for FDR. But I'm talking about politically to show strength. The Constitution does not set the number of justices on the Supreme Court. It has fluctuated throughout American history. It is up to Congress to set that number. They did so after the Civil War, and they can do so again. The president's job would be to convince a member of Congress to introduce such legislation and let them go at it. But my view is that politically only, this is the kind of thing that Joe Biden needs to do. Why are we still waiting on executive orders at the border? Why are we waiting for action on the Supreme Court? You are the president. People are frustrated, and your poll numbers, just look at the Bloomberg Morning Council poll, don't look so good. You've got to show strength. So from a political standpoint, I think he should, and I think he should push for it and let the chips fall where they may.
All right, Jeanne, Sheehan, Zaino, and Lester Munson, our political panel today. Thank you so much. Lester joining us from BGR, the international group, and Jeanne, Sheehan, Zaino, of course, is now newly a senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Great conversation, guys. Thank you so much. It's also worth noting we're having this conversation, Joe, about the Supreme Court on the same day that the Senate today confirmed the 200th federal judge.
That's right.
Under the Biden administration. It's about a month earlier than when we hit that mark under Donald Trump. But as we were just discussing, while Biden has gotten to confirm 200 judges during his tenure, not anyone confirmed to the Supreme Court. Donald Trump got 3 of those.
Yeah, that's true. You've got Ketanji Brown Jackson.
Yes, you're right. Just
maybe
the one
he'll get
versus
another.
the 3.
We'll see about that.
I don't know about that.
There's still time. We won't predict anything on that right now.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Welcome to the fastest show in politics. Wednesday edition, it's Balance of Power live from Washington with an eye on what's happening in Israel and Gaza. We've been talking about the temporary pier that the U.S. military just spent millions of dollars and many weeks to build to try to deliver humanitarian aid to Gaza, working our way around, in some cases, our ally in Israel, with gates closed in many cases to get food to where it needs to go in Gaza. Kailey, the word from the UN World Food Program today is not good. This $320 million project is apparently going to fail unless Israel does a better job ensuring its security, according to the UN.
Yeah, the UN coming out yesterday saying that no aid trucks had entered within the last 2 days via the floating pier set up for sea deliveries. They also said in that same statement that it suspended food distribution in Rafah due to lack of supplies and insecurity. So it speaks to just how dire the situation has become as you have so many people on the brink of famine. Yeah. In all actuality, something that, of course, the pier was aimed at trying to address, but perhaps not doing so as successfully as initially hoped. We did hear from Major General Pat Ryder, a spokesperson for the Defense Department, about this, and this is what he had to say.
It is a complex operation, and so we've been very clear from the beginning that we're going to take a crawl, walk, run approach to make sure that we are implementing this system in a way where we're working out the processes, the procedures, and including taking into account the security conditions. So I think you're going to see, as we work together, the amount of aid increase and the ability to get it distributed increase.
General Pat Ryder yesterday. Joining us now for more here on Balance of Power is Carmel Arbit, joining us from the Atlantic Council, where she is Senior Fellow for the Middle East Programs in the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative. Carmel, always great to have you back on the show. When we think about the aid situation specifically and the difficulty of getting aid to those who need it, he was speaking there of the security conditions that have to be taken into consideration here. Given the status on the ground right now, how realistic is it that those conditions can improve to the extent they need to in order to get food aid in at scale?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me back on. The challenges of distributing aid to Gaza and throughout the Strip have not gotten easier. To the contrary, it's only gotten more complex as the destruction of the Strip has worsened. There are really three challenges here that all touch on the security piece, which is logistical, the situation of desperation, which is really also impeding on that distribution, and then ultimately political. When the U.S. announced that they were going to set up this pier, it was very clear to everyone involved that this was going to be a very expensive and politically meaningful gesture, but that realistically it wasn't going to solve some of the key logistical issues, which is finding safe, secure, and functioning roads to transfer that aid across the Gaza Strip and to bring it to the communities that need it most. So that's the first key challenge that they're dealing with. The second is one of desperation. When Gazans see these trucks, they often are fearful that it is the only time they're going to have access to that sort of aid. And so they are charging those trucks and grabbing things and engaging in what some are calling self-distribution, because again, they are desperate. And then the third piece is really political will here. We're seeing challenges on the Israeli side as well, where Israeli extremists are looking to stop the flow of aid into Israel. But there is an incentive on the part of the Israeli government to move that aid forward as it works to coordinate support for its Rafah incursion with the United States. So all that is to say the challenges are formidable and will continue to be. And we might not see that port operational until this war is nearly at an end.
Well, that's saying something. We just heard from Jake Sullivan, Carmel, at the White House, National Security Advisor to the President, who says aid from the pier has reached some Palestinian civilians. But the fact is it takes at least a day to process the aid at the pier. There's very limited distribution in some areas of Gaza, certainly in Rafah. Was this a flawed concept to begin with?
Look, this is an impossible situation. Given, as I said, the security situation in Gaza, the inability to ensure that anyone who is delivering that aid is going to be safe, destruction on roads, all of these other pieces. In many ways, this was mission impossible, but also mission necessary. Just because it's difficult to get aid to the people in Gaza does not mean that anyone can step away from this imperative. People in Gaza are on the brink of a famine, and their situation isn't getting any better. So it behooves the international community to look for any possible avenue to increase that aid and distribution. But these types of complications and hiccups are going to be inevitable, given that there's also no real centralized civil distribution network within Gaza. And this blows open the continual problem in that Israel has no strategy for the day after and what comes next. And so we're seeing that play out in the immediate term, and we're going to continue to see it play out in the future.
Well, let's keep thinking about what comes next, because in light of what we have seen so far in the last 24 hours, Ireland, Norway, and Spain announcing that they would recognize a Palestinian state, and the subsequent Israeli recalling its ambassadors to those countries, not reacting well to this. I wonder, Carmel, if a number of sovereign countries saying that they would recognize a Palestinian state actually makes it less likely that that Palestinian state can be realized in the near term, because it only causes those currently in power to Israel to kind of retrench and circle the wagons and voice opposition to the idea of a two-state solution.
That's exactly right. The declaration of Palestinian statehood by countries, which, mind you, more than 100 countries, I think about 140, have already done that. But doing that in this moment, and generally, is deeply alienating for the Israelis, who feel that the Palestinians can't just be given this statehood recognition. Statehood must come through a negotiated, durable two-state solution, an agreement that both parties have come to. And the problem is that statehood is really just words. There aren't very serious practical implications for this. And so it doesn't move the parties closer together. It just divides them further.
Where is the administration now on operations in Rafah? Because our reporting says that the administration is softening its stand on this. I believe it was a red line for President Biden, said that on the record a couple of weeks ago. Is that red line moving?
So I think the question is whether the red line is moving or the Israelis are moving. And the answer is somewhere in between the two. The Israelis have taken very seriously what the United States has been saying. And there's been sort of a difference between what they're saying publicly and what they're saying behind closed doors. So publicly, Biden had put forward what was increasingly sounding like a generic red line. Any type of incursion into Rafah was unacceptable. But privately, that's not really what these conversations have looked like. What they've really been saying is that any incursion into Rafah has to look a certain way. There has to be serious and meaningful efforts to evacuate civilians. There has to be a pathway. The type of operation that's carried out matters a lot. And what we're seeing and hearing is what the Israelis are intending to do and have already begun doing is relatively narrow, in that what they're really focusing on is tunnels and transit routes in Rafah rather than kind of a larger scale piece. And that will allow them to contain civilian casualties, and in many ways already has. So we're finding a convergence in terms of what the Israeli and American position had been around Rafah.
Carmel, of course, while the U.S. administration's position has long been that they wouldn't like to see a major ground operation in Rafah that could cause massive civilian casualties, they also have been loudly, repeatedly calling for a temporary ceasefire deal and sending diplomats to the Middle East to try and further that effort. It feels like, though, now for all of the hope that maybe existed weeks ago, it's long gone. Is there any real prospect of a temporary ceasefire deal now?
I think the parties are going to continue to negotiate. The Israelis had hoped that the threat of a Rafah operation and what it could look like would strengthen their hands at the negotiating table, and felt that the U.S. had taken that away from them, essentially by hamstringing the extent of what Rafah could be. Because of that, the Egyptians have really withdrawn their role from this. Egypt had been, of course, also trying to prevent a Rafah operation. But what you see is the Qataris continuing to move ahead. We're also hearing conversations shift, where we're not just looking now at a temporary ceasefire. As this war starts to, again, kind of wind down, remember that there are only 4 brigades of Hamas that are still, battalions that are still operating in Rafah, and that's what Israel's been really interested in. But starting to think now more and more about what a long-term outcome would look like. And so you have Qatar still at the talk of temporary ceasefire talks, but also partnering up with the Saudis as the U.S. and the Saudis negotiate on a potential long-term negotiation for normalization. And that could also include an end to the conflict.
Carmel, your insights are always so helpful. We appreciate your time today. Carmel Arbit, in the throes of uncertainty over the effectiveness of this pier, we'll see what happens with U.S. operations as we move our way forward. And analysis from Carmel at the Atlantic Council always helps us out. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.